You've talked about Northern Africa's aquifer, and it kind of ties into the whole Great Reset and possible changing growing zones. And after watching Bill Gates talking about that exact topic, about how they would have to move their resources and farms from one place to another by 2030 and 2050 because of the crop yields decreasing. Like I said before, I don't know if they're talking about all crops or he was talking about just the crops that they own. But what they were calling them was climate sensitive crops, which makes you wonder, why are they already planning this far ahead to actually move grow zones?
If you hadn't woken up by now, and I appreciate you and thank you for watching through and listening to our talk so far, if you haven't seen anything up to this point in 2022 that would have shaken you and gone into some action to get prepared with seeds, tools, community, etc., this ag conference I just went to, our carrying capacity for what we can grow is no longer even at the break even. We're below that this year. And it's going to be well below that next year. And everybody's going to be vying for grain. And they're not going to get it. So then what gets affected? Well, the dairy. Then where's your milk come from? Where's your protein powder? You got babies, you say, well, I don't drink milk. I don't care. Okay, well, where's your infant formula coming from? The protein that's processed from that milk. Cheeses, all these things, whey powder, all going to be constricted because they can't get the grain to get them out of there to get the dairy cattle and produce. Like it literally touches every single supermarket shelf and everything that you're going to put in your mouth in terms of a protein source. Like that beef, they're going to have real tough time keeping supply chains open and full supply chains. That was another thing. One last thing. I'm sorry, Rance. I'm going to go to the last. I said last. My bad. But I did not know this. Currently in the supply chain at any one time in America, at any one time, there's 1 billion bushels of grain ready for storage, getting on the rail lines, on barges, out on vessels, exporting, in the transit in trucks from a field somewhere to be able to then on-sell that or on-load to another, whatever it be. At any one time in America right now, there's 1 billion bushels are waited to move. It's not moving anymore. And they're thinking that might creep down to like 800 million, which at that point, then everything on our planet in terms of food pricing will not exist anymore. It'll be that valuable and non-attainable. We're going to go into rationing. Trying to think through this whole thing that I just witnessed was, startling. And we live in this world. So for me to get that shocked where I sit down and go, this is really it.
I think it's important for people to realize where we're at on some of these things. And I'm kind of glad you brought up the water, because I wanted to bring that up last week. For some reason, it slipped my mind. But since you said that while you were talking, I brought up a pretty good article that breaks it down. I've talked about it lots of times, but it's easier to read who owns what and what that actually means. So let's go through this idea of, I'm going to say, the next 10 years of what it's going to look like for the average global citizen. And we'll start here. Major supermarket in UK planning to sell bugs as food to help poor people through the winter, because they already know that this is going to be a horrible winter for a lot of people because they've planned it that way. And you say you can't help but feel like it's planned. Well, there's too much evidence in the direction of pre-planning so far back that it kind of boggles the mind that they would get everything to sum up at this point. But anyway, so you got here, they're trying to help people by feeding them bugs in the winter. So think peasant times. The food crisis of 2023. And as you said, if you get into this article, it kind of touches on a lot of the stuff that you were talking about. European fertilizer production already shut down, currency problems causing a massive headache for poor nations that need to import food, global weather patterns. Of course, they got to throw that in there, because this will be the most expensive Thanksgiving dinner in American history for the turkey prices. And they're talking about, according to Zero Hedge, it's just going to get worse. And we'll show you why we know it's going to get worse, and so do they. Here's one from The Guardian. Prepares secret scripts for possible use in winter blackout, citing that everything from telephones to internet to power will be turned off, possibly 2 days at a time, maybe 2 weeks, whatever. Anyway, according to this, the BBC has prepared secret scripts that could be read on air if energy shortages causes blackouts or a loss of gas suppliers this winter. So they have already planned on this energy struggle to cause people heartache. And then let's move over here. Let's talk about water, because that's really important. We talk about land and farming and sustainable living, but none of that can really be done if you do not have access to water. So the Great Water Grab is this article Santa Fe River. It's a great article. It's talking about who owns the actual water, and it gets in here and it breaks it down. And who owns the water? The new water barons are Wall Street banks and elite multi-billionaires, and they're buying up water, and they have been for the last 40 years all over the planet. But right here, Citigroup, Deutsche Bank, UBS, the Macquarie Bank, if I said that right, Barclay Bank, Blackstone Group, HSBC, they're all up there as the top people buying water. And then you got T. Boone Pickens, former President George H.W. Bush, which died, and his family. So you know the Bushes still control that. And then you got Hong Kong's Lee Kang-ting, if I said that right. And then you got a guy over in the Philippines. And these are all billionaires that are just buying up water all over the planet. They're buying it in Argentina. They're buying it up. So right here, just by himself, billionaire T. Boone Pickens owns more water rights than any other individual in America, with rights to enough of the aquifer drain of approximately 200,000 acre feet or 65 billions of gallons of water a year. That's him. So what happens when Bill Gates and all of these other people own everything, from the internet messages that are getting out to your food needs, and the same group controls the water? And remember, these are the same groups that are pushing local governments to make it against the law for you to collect water naturally, saying that the state or the province or the country or whatever municipality you live in owns the rainwater, and not just the rainwater, but the runoff water. And we all know how it works with water on land. You have to have water rights to that water, and also water under your land. You have to own the water rights to that if you're going to be putting a well up or trying to get any amount of water out of it. So if all of the corporations, billionaires, own all of the water, how do the other farming entities compete if they just turn off their water? Because they're not going to turn off their water for their own companies and their own usage. It's just going to be their competition, and no one can really say anything because they own the water rights, and that's how that works. So why would they be buying up water rights all over the world? And in that article, it talks about Northern Africa being one of the main places people are buying up water rights. So you got Northern Africa, South America, and places all over the United States just that we know about, where they are going to control the farming. There's no doubt about that, because if you control the water rights, you control the farming. You know, maybe if you want water, you might have to buy some Monsanto seeds. You can see where that goes, where it puts people in positions to do things that they wouldn't normally do, or make deals that they wouldn't normally do. And when people own the water rights, they can also use those water rights to pressure municipalities and other government agents to do what they want instead of the need of the people. And when you think about this, the richest of the richest owning the water, and then think about places like Flint, Michigan, and Mississippi, and all of these places where the infrastructure is falling apart. These people have been sitting around for decades collecting billions of dollars to keep that infrastructure up. It leads you to other topics like the grid. And the same thing is happening there. These people that control it on the government end are not using the money to upkeep or evolve their systems to fit the needs of the public. Instead, they're allowing it all to collapse. And most of these things have time limits on it. Everything from a PVC pipe to a steel pipe, they all have lifespans. And it goes along with the automotive industry. The automotive industry does the same thing. You get a brand new car, you think it's going to last forever, but things are biodegradable and they have a shelf life on them, and they're designed to break after a certain point. My point being with that everything is planned, obviously, so that while the infrastructure collapses, the billionaires and the oligarchs are collecting more and more, not only money, but rights. As we think about it, the Supreme Court has already ruled in the United States that having water is not a human right. And the reason for that is because people own water rights, and the government wants to keep the position that they also own the water that falls from the sky. So there's already places in Oregon where you cannot collect it. There's other places around the U.S. that are making laws right now where you cannot collect it. And this is all like a net that kind of closing in on the individual sufficient living human being, where they cannot get power, they cannot get food, they cannot get information, they cannot get water, except through these government and corporate portals. And that's the design. And when we go back to the social credit score, how do you think that will fit in along with this carbon credit score? Because they're mushing all of these ideas together. And the only people that are going to feel the pain of this transition into this ultra portioned reality is that the peasant is going to starve to death. They're the only people that have no way to fight back this system. So even if you're at home gardening, what happens when the municipality turns off the water because they're protecting the earth by stopping you from growing things? You know, the list goes on and on. You can't collect that water. You can't plant there. You can't use organic seeds. I'm waiting for that to actually come around the corner, is where governments start banning certain types of foods, which they have in the past, to where you only have the choice but to go down to Walmart and buy their one choice of GMO source of food with a little bit of bugs in it. And you can go home to your house. The electricity's turned off for the night so they can save power. And maybe your water's turned off, so because there's a so-called drought or water shortage.
Water rights, water shortages. Bill Gates not really buying farmland for farmland, but buying that land to control the water rights, moving through multiple points of the main ag space and the flows of irrigation into that. And yeah, if you could continue on, because I was super interested listening to you as we went on the break about, you know, the control of water where you can't even harvest it off your roof because some states have said, well, we would sell it on in the water stream. And I'm thinking, really? You got how many millions of people in each state, and you really think that 5 families collecting rainwater is going to somehow affect your revenue? Because you got to look at that. And the same thing with gold and silver. There's less than 1% of all Americans who even own precious metals. Less than 1%. That would be the same with rainwater collection off your roof. Probably 0.25% even. But then they want to pass laws so that 0.25% of the populace cannot even harvest their own rainwater. It's not about this is revenues. It's about reducing your ability to get off centralized systems. But now their whole thing is to get you back on centralized systems because in the collapse phase, which you're in, economic, food, they're going to get you back in under the rationing card to be able to get your allotments. You disobey in any way, shape, or form, they are going to destruct your ability on the digital side to purchase and on the digital side for your digital rationing card to be able to go in and purchase items.
Yeah, I was just wondering how that's going to work out when tycoons own the water rights to the land. They don't actually occupy the land, and the only way for them to do that is through government to enforce any of that. If things did go tits up, how are these billionaires going to enforce their ownership of the water? It doesn't really make sense in the long run, but it does show you that they've been planning. And when I was going through these facts and pieces of this article, most of them go back to September of 2003, when Goldman Sachs first started being the largest private equity of private water. And it just keeps going on. And they're talking about that, water is the oil of the 21st century. You skip a decade into about 2015, and Goldman Sachs and the other ones are still claiming that the oil of the future. And that's where all the plans are going. And it kind of really links in a big way to what you've talked about Northern Africa's aquifer. And it kind of ties into the whole Great Reset and possible changing growing zones. And after watching Bill Gates talking about that exact topic, about how they would have to move their resources and farms from one place to another by 2030 and 2050 because of the crop yields decreasing. You know, like I said before, I don't know if they're talking about all crops or he was talking about just the crops that they own. But what they were calling them was climate sensitive crops, which makes you wonder, why are they already planning this far ahead to actually move grow zones? And he started to get into that. And we've been talking about this giant aquifer in Northern Africa. Now, who owns all of the water rights to that? And you can see that it's probably some of these billionaire oligarchs, maybe people from Saudi Arabia, Dubai, but most of all, the banks that are the smaller banks of the central banking system. And then when you think about, was this or wasn't this planned all for this time period, it kind of shows you that absolutely it was. They knew it was coming for at least 2 to 3 decades. The people that are in the know are buying up what they know will be the future in control, because water and food are kind of hard to separate. If you control the water, then necessity says, you're controlling the food. I actually saw a guy being interviewed, and you might have saw this too, probably in his mid-20s, but he completely believed that the world needs to stop farming to save the planet.
They probably think food comes from a supermarket, and that's all they know is it comes from a supermarket. Where does that come from? Well, no, the food's in the supermarket. Why would you waste your time gardening and spending all that backbreaking work to put the shovel in the ground and get the dirt and then throw stuff in it and mix things and then finally plant, and then you got to wait. And then there's insects and stuff, and you got to wash it after you get it home. Well, why don't you just go to the supermarket and get all that where it's already done for you? You're going to save so much time and energy. These are really the types of thoughts that are coming across in a percentage of the public. Is talking about winter garden seeds now going to be a bannable offense? Because I talked about kale, I talked about cabbage, kohlrabi, and all these mighty heavy leafy greens that are just the most all-stars for micronutrients and vitamins and that sort of thing in the winter months. Was that suddenly verboten to talk about growing lettuce in this shoulder season here? You can get a quick, 60-day rotation crop before it gets too cold because lettuce loves the cool. And people will say, well, I couldn't grow the lettuce in the summer. Well, neither could I really. It's always too hot. That's why we plant late February. And then it gives that month to start to warm it up in March, and then boom, right in April, then it just starts hitting its sprint. Then we'll get continuous production. What about talking about making tinctures from elderberry or black walnut husks yourself that are dropping right now in plentiful amounts if you can get to those black walnuts before the worms or the other thing in the forest that wants to nibble that protein source? They're making it illegal to collect rainwater on your own roof, on your own property. Are they going to make it illegal to wild forage also because suddenly you're taking money out of the corporate revenue that would have gone in? So somehow you're not allowed to even wild forage because you're denting into the bottom dollar of the corporation. Like the thing about history, and I always say a history book is your crystal ball. Then you start to look at these patterns that are evolving and the things that we see in cyclical patterning. Water is going to be the most important thing for you to have. You can't cook without it. You can't bathe without it. You can't grow food without it. And once you could be the toughest mountain man, mountain woman on the planet. As soon as you get too unhygienic, your body's going to get sick. Access to water for cleanliness is going to be another thing. So the best guess for 2023 would be hyperinflation, because another thing that was sort of talked about, but a lot of people weren't getting the gist, was cross-border payments using digitized physical assets with a repository in both nations that would honor those agreements and those smart contracts to deliver said asset. Like talking about carbon trading and carbon credits and allocations in the cryptocurrency sphere and the whole digitized asset moving across borders, they're in the headlights like, well, the one guy's asking me, dude, I don't want to buy this gold thing you're talking about. I just want to know, do I need to go buy a bunch of grain right now based on your research of the Southern Hemisphere eruptions? It boils down to that. Like, dude, how are you going to pay for that? How are you going to move money or value across the border that's accepted between two parties? These are the kind of unknowns that people aren't putting and plugging into the equation. Okay, you got a full currency collapse. That happens every time we come into this cycle. Currency collapse, population migration and reduction, and then a restructuring of government, because after the cycle ends, then the government believes they still have the power to try to rule over people, but frequencies changed, and then a new way of governance pops in. So just take it back to the very base here of economic upheaval during these collapse periods. How do you pay for something across a different country that might have a collapsing fiat currency? Because if I know yours is junk, I don't want it, but I will take digitized gold where I know in a depository I can walk in there with my smart contract and you're going to give me like 100 pounds of gold over the counter, literally. 100 kilos, 1 ton. Like I can walk in there as a bearer note on demand and say, give me the 1 ton of gold. Or I want to take equity out of that and I will leave that as a deposit on collateral. And then I'll get working capital in my own country based on that. This is going to intersect pretty interestingly here as we move through. I don't know, there's going to be more control. That's all I'm going to say is this digital ration card is inbound. And see, once you put that digital ration card with cross-border payments, then it starts to make sense on where the world has moved to already in the planners. They understood these crop losses were here or coming in inbound cycle 30 years ago, and they were planning, and now we sit here. Well, the same thing. They knew the economy would collapse, and then suddenly cryptocurrency pops out in, 2008 and 2009. Suddenly, just in time to really get legs in a lot of distributed ledger and settlements with DLT over on RippleNet and R3 and a few other privates. I can't believe that's introduced and up and running right at this point where fiats are going to collapse and we'll have an alternative payment system at the same time, dude. There can't be this many things overlapping. Come on. Even somebody that doesn't understand anything would be like, it's a little quirky.
You were talking about all that stuff. You keep it in a question format, like, did they plan it? What are they planning? And I'm in a different spot. I feel like they're just telling us what they're planning in our faces. Like I was mentioning a minute ago, that this is an era, unlike, say, the Renaissance, where people were learning different sciences. Somebody that did astronomy was also playing with inventing stuff, and they were also reading the ancient books, and they were philosophizing, and they were learning all this stuff. They were learning how to guard. I mean, they knew all kinds of stuff. They were like 10 times the mind of people now. The whole idea that man is going to control the climate in any way or shape is a ridiculous idea. And let me give you an example of why. It's because they have no idea what the actual inner cycles are. There's cycles inside cycles inside cycles, and everything on this planet lives on those cycles. Every form of life on this planet has some kind of cycle that interacts with the environment in some way to have special conditions, from fungus all the way to mammals. So I point out this article from AP. It's a mysterious breeding habits of aquarium fish have experts confused. And it talks about how scientists and breeders and all these people, they can't figure out how to breed these fish that are coming from the coral reefs, and they can't get them to reproduce. And instead, they just go out and they use poisons to poison them, and then they get more and they bring them back because they just don't breed in captivity. And now they're finding out that that was kind of nonsense. And the truth is that they just didn't understand the global environment and the cycles within it, and how the animals interact in that, and how some of them go extinct and how some of them explode in numbers from different circumstances. I'm sure you're familiar with algae blooms and other things that happen in the ocean because of temperature variations. And they kept trying to have exact conditions of the degrees of out in the ocean and the conditions. And then one time, according to this article, this big fishery, the power goes out and they couldn't control the temperature of the water. And then all of a sudden, these tropical fish are just breeding. They're laying eggs everywhere. It just shows you that they don't even understand that. And not only that, it goes back to the idea of trying to control the environment without knowing the repercussions of what you're doing.
But knowing these electromagnetic changes are inbound along with these changes of government, see, they're keeping, everybody distracted as can be from anything in the heavens increasing that would validate that our planet is just one of the 9 affected by the sun. But the biggest thing is the distraction. Now, this frequency change that's occurring right now is going to sweep through our planet, and has begun to. It's begun probably 4 to 5 years ago, and you'll see that how many mass awakenings have we had? The central banking was one of those. Occupy Wall Street was another. And we swung into all the food riots across so many nations. How many nations were in Europe that were under food protest asking governments to turn back on the pipeline? I think it was 22 to 25, somewhere in there. It was increasing every day. So they're pointing the finger at the elite, or these rulers of the countries, and go, you turned off the gas, our lives are becoming miserable, food's expensive, turn it back on, or you no longer have the right to rule. And boom, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2 down, and then suddenly, who are you going to protest against? So what they did is they deflated that movement. And I will say the same thing in 2019 for those of you who were distracted that didn't see it or were unaware of it, because a lot of news was trying to bury this. There were street protests literally in 20 plus. It seems like that's the magic number. When it rolls over 20 countries in something happening against the elite, they squash it with more distraction. But if it helps their cause, they allow it to run through all nations. 2019, the overnight lending repo market was broken completely. At some points, they were putting $800 billion a night into it to keep it afloat. Central banks around the world understood, hey, we can't keep doing this. I mean, sheesh, this is not going to last. And then whoosh, COVID comes in, and suddenly quantitative easing, and they could print as much money as they needed to for everybody to still then reset that system with just doubling the amount of the money supply on the planet for a reason. Most of it not in your pocket or mine. Most of it in company coffers. Well, now it's just become outright electrical and food. This is going to really amplify this winter. And, Ransom, when you were talking about the new strain that they were developing and that I think it was 80% of the rats didn't, make it through these experiments, perhaps when the food shortages get to the point where the populace reacts, that's really absolutely going to disrupt the system. At that point, we may see this next one flowing in there. Something nefarious, like you said, and not really kind or friendly toward humanity is here. It's moving its moves across the chessboard. And you just have to wonder, how fast is it all going to take place? But I'm going to say using the benchmarks of food riots across countries that are no longer because of energy. It's just gone strictly for food at that point. Energy, yeah, okay, whatever. But once you see it's all about food and the news headlines are dominated by the food shortages, once it reached the 20th, 23rd, 24th country, that's when something else for a distractive narrative to distract you will be unleashed at the Uber.
I would have to say just pay attention to what the banks are doing right now, because they are definitely up to some kind of major move. When I see Goldman Sachs and other bankers having a secret meeting offshore that's invite only, it kind of brings up thoughts of Bilderberg, Davos, and other meetings that these people that run the world are having. The evidence is there for them all scrambling to get together some kind of plan that they have ongoing. You can count on this being a focal point for the next, I'm going to say, half a decade of problems and the blame game.